Well, hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining us for this online message. If you're out of town, hopefully we'll see you again real soon. If you're not feeling well, hopefully you'll bounce back and you'll be able to join us as quickly as possible. I have here a copy of the bulletin/worship guide, and if you are aware, the back side is full of information. The top is called the box. And in the box, it's the schedule. There's prayer house Wednesday night, Friday morning, men's Bible study. Friday night is the Hearing God Bible study. Saturday morning is the women's study. Later on in October, we have a couple deep dive classes. But we also, on Saturday, October 28th, are hosting a family fun fall festival. We would love it if you would come. We would love it if you would invite some people. This is for the whole family. We're going to have a cornhole tournament, chili cook-off. We're going to have all kinds of fun. So it's not just for the kids. It's for everybody. We have a bunch of little flyers and handouts. We'd love to get those into your hands so you can invite people to come. Now, to do this, we obviously need some help. So send us an email at connect@deeprivers.church or just give me a call, shoot me a text, let me know. But we'd love you to come. We'd love you to invite some people, and we'd love you to help out with it. So that's kind of the big thing going on. We're also collecting sweatshirts still for the migrant camp. We have one more trip scheduled in a couple weeks. So, all right. Nicole and I grew up outside of Chicago. I grew up in Northwest Indiana. Nicole grew up in a northern suburb of Chicago, so we weren't terribly far apart, a couple hours away apart, but with a huge city in between. And no matter where you lived in the Chicagoland area, you knew about one church, and that was Willow Creek. That was one of the first mega churches that kind of popped up in the United States. It was very attractional, and there's a lot of things you could say about Willow Creek. And there's this one story I heard that I just kind of want to explain a little bit. Willow Creek, still a huge church, but it was one of the first kind of mega churches. And they had church on Sunday, and then afterwards, everybody went out for lunch. So all the area restaurants just got blitzed, It was like a concert, thousands and thousands of people leaving church and all going to one of the local restaurants. Well, the pastor there got a letter from one of the waitresses at one of the local restaurants and said, "Hey, I just need to let you know that when everybody comes from your church, we all know where they're coming from because they all show up at the same time, and we could just tell. And it's not a great look, not because we don't mind getting all the business. It's not great because they're very poor tippers. Your church has a reputation, I think it's fair to say, that people come, they enjoy, they're dressed nice, they're coming from church, it looks like they have some money or whatever it is, but they are very bad tippers, and it's just not a good look for you." The pastor actually read this letter to the entire church. And I think his point was, you are a witness in how you live your life. And especially when you leave here, you are a witness to the community and all the restaurants and the servers around there. It was encouragement for him it was his encouragement for his church to be generous. We're not, I don't know, I can't say the make it blanket statement that we're not generous. But the message this weekend is on the fact that God is generous. Regardless of whether you're generous or not, that's not the point. The point is, do you see God as generous? And you might think, oh, that's an interesting attribute. Well, it really does cut to the core, to the effect, really. It does. It's got a huge, profound effect on our lives, whether we see God as generous or not. So as we wrap up this real short sermon series, we're talking about the fact that God is generous. Last week it was God is patient. This week it's God is generous. In fact, sometimes we might not agree with that attribute or not think about it, but sometimes we actually ascribe the opposite, and we think God is stingy or God is withholding. And again, the ramifications of that viewpoint really play out in our lives, I think, almost every day. So this is what 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 through 11 has to say. It's our main text for the weekend. It says this: He, God, He gives generously to the poor. His generosity is everlasting. God, who provides seed for the sower and gives bread for food, will provide and multiply your seed and increase your harvests of generosity. You will be made rich in every way so that you can always be very generous, and your generosity will lead others to be grateful to God. Now, let's be honest, the point of the passage is Paul is encouraging his readers in the church of Corinth to be generous. We need to be a generous people. But his point is that God is generous, and our generosity is fueled by his generosity to us. Okay? So yeah, the passage is saying we need to be generous, but what fuels our generosity is the fact that God is generous. But the truth is, we often live what we could call a poverty mindset. I guess there's been times I've wrestled with this a little bit. A poverty mindset is always looking at what you don't have. A poverty mindset is always wondering if there's going to be enough for the future. A poverty mindset can affect everyone. Even rich people can suffer a poverty mindset. A rich person might go, I really need some new tires for my car. Maybe I could push it off till next year, because I don't want to spend the money, or what happens, and sometimes we don't buy things that we should be buying because we're afraid that, we won't have it in the future. A poverty mindset can come from your upbringing. Obviously, if you grew up in a home as a kid where money was an issue, it's real easy to kind of pick up on that poverty mindset. But I think a poverty mindset can be the result not just of your upbringing, but your view of God. And that's why I'm saying that this idea that God is generous, not just a really tangent thing, it really does come back to how you view God. And then we'll keep unpacking what that means. But trust me, it's a pretty serious issue. Here's an unexpected verse that you might not be expecting when it comes to looking at the generosity of God. It's the most popular verse I think there is, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave, his only begotten Son. You know the rest. God so loved the world that he gave. This might be a strange, different thought to you, but I think it's worth pondering. Is salvation a gift of generosity? Do we have a right to be forgiven and reconciled of our sins? Now, we think of generosity as something we almost deserve, and we almost think of our salvation as something that God had to do. Is the fact that God offers us salvation, is that in fact alone just an act of generosity? I think that's a question worth pondering. Romans 8:32 says this: He, again God, He did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all. How will He not also, along with Him, graciously give us all things? Now, we hear the word grace, gracious, and I don't think we ever, or too often, or not enough, equate that with generosity. That grace, graciousness, and generosity really are synonymous in so many ways. When we think of grace, maybe recast it, reframe it. Think a little bit about God as generous, not just gracious. So these two passages, this side of the cross, we could think of, okay, God is generous now, but has he always been this way? In fact, if we're not careful, we could kind of look at the Bible and say, well, there's an Old Testament version of God and there's a New Testament version of God. Well, we need to break that down to break that understanding that there's two different gods, or he dealt with people differently. The point is that there's generosity that's seen in the Old Testament as well. Generosity, God's grace, is not just a New Testament thing. All right, let's start. We can't go back any further than creation, the generosity of creation. God created Adam and Eve, humanity, and put them in paradise, put them in a perfect place, a magnificent dwelling place. Not only that, he gave them an amazing collection of senses to enjoy it. You could see a measure of God's generosity in how he put us in a perfect relationship with him in a perfect place. It was designed to reveal the most important thing, the Creator's existence and the Creator's character. Okay? So even creation is an act of generosity. Now, it's too easy, unfortunately, for us just to complain about creation. You know, last weekend we were camping. It got wet and it got cold, and I didn't always have an appreciation for creation last weekend when I was freezing in a tent and trying to keep warm and dry. But oftentimes we don't see any or not enough of a generosity in creation. We just tend to complain when it's not what we desire it to be. So you can make the argument that there's generosity just in the very fact that God created us and put us in a place of perfect relationship with him. Generosity is also seen in the fact that God desires a covenant relationship with us. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless him, and him who dishonors you I will curse. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you and all your families of the earth shall be blessed." Here's the point. Abram, later Abraham, changed his name. Abram did nothing to deserve this. That was just God being generous, God being gracious to him. He says, "Go from your country." In the next breath, "I will make you a great nation." And he says, "I'm going to bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. Out of you will come a blessing." We know ultimately that is the person of Jesus. God's covenant blessings, his promises, are his generosity on display. And again, I don't know if we always recognize that. He makes covenants, he keeps covenants, not because of what he sees in us, but because of the generosity of who he is, the generosity that's inside him. So he makes a covenant with us. He makes promises to us throughout Scripture and even now, not because of what he sees in us. God so loved the world, God so loved you that he died for your sins even when you were sinful and far away as a person or us as humanity. So there's generosity not just seen in the creation of humanity and again put in relationship with him, but in God's promises to us, his desire for a covenant relationship. God further shows his generosity to his people in the Old Testament by bringing them out of freedom to freedom, out of slavery to freedom, to freedom from slavery. The generosity caused God to raise up Moses and harness the forces of nature, as you know the story. Be faithful because he was faithful to the promises he made to Abraham. He rescued his children from captivity, defeating the army of Pharaoh. And here's where it really gets interesting. So not only is generosity seen in delivering them from slavery to freedom, you know what happens in the story? They asked the Egyptians, the Hebrews on their way out during the Exodus, they asked the Egyptians for articles of silver, gold, and clothing. And God made the Egyptians favorably disposed, is how the text says, favorably disposed to them, and they gave them what they asked for. The Hebrews plundered the Egyptians as they were leaving. I don't know if we ever, think that much about that facet of the story. The Hebrews plundered the Egyptians as they were leaving their slavery. In fact, you could kind of say that it was actually the opposite. The Egyptians plundered themselves. It wasn't that the Hebrew people had to take the articles of gold and silver and clothing by force. The Egyptians seemingly gladly handed it over. And then they're out in the desert. They're in they're outside of Egypt, and then there's another form of generosity that's seen. It's generosity of the law. Now, some people might think, really? How is God's law an act of generosity? Well, think about it. The people are free. They're homeless. They're traumatized. They're powerless. They're also ungoverned. And they're living in what you could describe as a fractured culture. They have received new life, but they did not know how to live. And just think about the example of the golden calf, how sad it is that when they get their freedom, one of the first things they seemingly do is to create an idol, a golden calf. At this point, God blessed them with the most practical of gifts. He blessed them with his law. He blessed them with explaining what his expectations are of them. The clarity is kindness. It is kind to have, sorry. It's kind to give clear expectations. The law is a testament. It's evidence. It's proof. It's a demonstration of the extent of the generosity of his love. Again, excuse me. I got a little bit of a cold sleeping in a wet, cold tent. You could make the argument that one of the worst parents that you're ever going to see is the one of the parents who doesn't give any boundaries to their kids. That is a form of child abuse, when you let your kid raise itself instead of laying down some clear expectations. That is a form of neglect. God is generous in sharing his expectations with us. And then obviously there's the generosity of the promised land. You know, the spies say this in Deuteronomy 1:25. It is a good land that the Lord is giving us. Now, did they celebrate God's generosity? Did they celebrate God delivering on his promise? No, actually they turned against their generous God who had been providing for them. But in spite of this, there would still one day be a palace and a temple in the land, and where generations would live in prosperity. God's patience was lavish generosity. Patience is a form of generosity. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. There are another point to ponder. God is being generous when he's patient with us. I found this quote: "The Father requires generosity from his children because he is the definition of generosity. He is patient, kind, and faithful. He doesn't just react to the moment. His generosity has an eye to the future. His generosity is not just a present gift, but also an investment in a legacy." So God is patient with us. God is generous with us. So what blocks it? What gets in the way of us truly believing in our head and then also sensing in our heart that God is indeed generous? It's part of our human nature, or it's part of our fallen human nature that we need to address and deal with. There's a story in Acts chapter 14. Paul and Barnabas perform a healing. God performs a healing, technically, through Paul and Barnabas in Lystra. And this is what happens. They do this healing, the people see it, and the people respond to the healing by saying, "The gods are here among us." So they see Paul and Barnabas as not human, but some form of God. And then they're determined to offer sacrifices in their honor. I think Paul and Barnabas were probably aghast. God used them to heal somebody, and what do they want to do? They almost kind of want to worship Paul and Barnabas, that gods are here among us. So Paul and Barnabas cut it off real quick, and they say this. This is Acts chapter 14. "The living God has sent us to turn you away from such worthless things. He's the one who made all there is. He's the one who brings you the rain and the crops and all the good things. Listen now to the good news we have to share about what he has done for you." The people saw a miracle. They saw a blessing. They saw an act of God's generosity. And how did they react? Did they say, hey, tell us more about this? No. For a pagan, for the world, I know you don't like the word pagan, but for the world, the favor of the gods always comes at a cost. That's the worldly mindset. The favor, whether it's a healing in Lystria or whether it's us, there's always a cost to it. That's the world's transactional way of thinking. Whenever there's the favor of the gods back in this time, and I think it's still a mindset that's still present today, it always comes at a cost. In this story, they were obligated to show thanks. If not, the gods might take away the blessing or turn away from them in the future when they needed their help. If they're not thankful now, how could they expect the gods to help them in their future? So something happened and they wanted to show a measure. They felt obligated to do something because there's always a cost in the world when there's a blessing. Now, you might be thinking, how sad or even how silly, but how often do we think the same way? We still have a transactional mindset. It's part of our human nature. God's grace, we really have a hard time with it. We don't understand it. That transactional mindset, it creeps into everything. You might even have these thoughts. Why am I suffering? Is God punishing me? Something bad happened. A lot of people think something bad happens and it's a form of God's punishment. Or the opposite. I've been good. I'm sure God will help me. Look at all I've done, all the sacrifices I've made. Doesn't God owe me something? It's really easy, really super easy for us to slip into that transactional understanding. If your view of God is not one where he's generous, if you don't see God as generous, you will think that the earning of the good, you think you are earning or need to earn the good things that you want. Conversely, if you see God, or not conversely, but in addition to that, if you think God is stingy, you'll need to wrestle out of him the blessings that you want. Think about that. Just think, how has this transactional mindset crept into our thinking, into your thinking, into my thinking? The law drives all of these thoughts. Now you might think the law, come on, that's Old Testament stuff. This is New Testament. We're in a new covenant age. You might think the law doesn't apply to you at all. Well, no, it doesn't, but yes, it still kind of does. The mindset of the law is still there. The law has this transactional mindset to it. But now, God now chooses to work differently. Instead of pointing to the law, he works generously through the outpouring of grace. Again, Paul in Lystria, he says, God is the one who provided rain, harvest, food, joy in life, and now Jesus. Okay? We need to see God as generous. If we don't see God as generous, we're going to fall back into, I've got to earn, I got to work for something. Take an inventory of your life and ask, how has God generously blessed you? And again, in your humanness, you might look at all the things you wish were different, all the things you want. You have to be honest and look at both sides of the coin. How has God generously blessed you? All right. Kind of the last point of this message is, again, I mentioned it a couple weeks ago. A lot of the things that we wrestle with are not just head issues, they're heart issues. And too oftentimes I think we just try to convince ourselves of God's truth and make it an intellectual pursuit when it's really a heart thing. I'm going to read a pretty significant portion of Psalm 104. And my question, my ask is to prayerfully let this psalm speak to your heart. All right, this is not just a head thing, this is a heart thing. So prayerfully I ask, let this psalm speak to your heart. It says in Psalm 104, He makes springs pour into the ravines. It flows between the mountains. They give water to all the beasts of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the sky nest by the waters. They sing among the branches. He waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The land is satisfied by the fruit of his work. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens human hearts, oil to make their faces shine, and bread that sustains their hearts. The trees of the Lord are well watered, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. There the birds make their nest, the stork has its home in the junipers. The high mountains belong to the wild goats, the crags are a refuge for the larks. He made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows when to go down. You bring darkness, it becomes night, and all the beasts of the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. The sun rises and they steal away. They return and lie down in their dens. Then people go out to their work, to their labor until evening. How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is a sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. All the ships go to and fro. The Leviathan, which you formed, frolic there. All creatures look to you to give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. My hope is, reading this psalm, that it does minister to your heart. And this becomes a heart truth, not just an intellectual truth, but that we truly, truly feel that God is generous with us. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but if we see God as generous, we're going to see our salvation in a different light, and we're going to recognize what grace is in a deeper level. And there's going to be a lot of fruit that comes from it. No more striving, no more earning. Joy can only be found if we believe God is generous. We should be a joyful people. It's going to be hard, maybe impossible, to be joyful if we really don't see God as generous. So, all right, well, thank you again for joining us. Hope to see you again in person real soon. Take care, and God bless.